Rex Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to go to the concerns you expressed last week about the federal police raids on the ABC and the News Corp journalists. You said that the government and the Home Affairs Secretary showed no respect for the freedom of the press. What gave you that idea?
Well, I'm of the view that we should balance very carefully the needs of national security and making sure that at the same time we guarantee freedom of the press. The press play an extremely important role in our democracy, and we need to be very mindful of that in these sorts of situations.
Yeah, but your media release on the 4th of June said that the Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton and Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pizzullo clearly hate media scrutiny. What evidence is there for that?
Well, if I go back to when the foreign interference and legislation was brought into the Parliament in early 2018, and that is legislation that would have been informed by Home Affairs, because Home Affairs sets both national security policy and law enforcement policy. There were absolutely no protections at all in the original bill that came into the Parliament for journalists. Of course, I spoke out very strongly at the time, and then the PJCIS moved into action, and eventually we ended up with protections in place for journalism.
Well, that's all well and good, and that's the to and fro of politics, policy debate, lawmaking. But you've said in clear terms that both the Minister and the Secretary of the Department hate media scrutiny, and you've gone on to say that the Australian Federal Police raids were clearly intended to have a chilling effect on journalistic inquiry. What evidence is there for any of these statements?
Well, for example, if the police really wanted to get access to information about Annika Smethurst, they could have gone through the process of getting a journalist information warrant and then essentially quietly and in their own time working through the metadata that could have been supplied to them by Telstra or Vodafone, whoever Annika's mobile phone provider is, or indeed her ISP. Instead, they chose to take a pathway that was very public and, in my view, quite unnecessary. But
you've said, just let me bring you back to your own words, you've said that the Australian Federal Police clearly intended to have a chilling effect on journalistic inquiry, and that the government, in the same paragraph, the government and the department hate media scrutiny. You're suggesting there that this is a politically motivated raid deliberately designed to chill journalistic inquiry. Is there any evidence to support any of that?
Well, once again, I've told you that when they took legislation to the Parliament, there was no regard for journalistic freedom. And I actually can't understand how that happens. I can't understand how people working inside departments, well-resourced departments, don't consider these sorts of issues when they are proposing legislation.
But, Senator Patrick, you understand what you're saying here. What you are saying here by saying that a minister and a department head and the police force are all acting deliberately to have a chilling effect on journalistic inquiry and that they hate media scrutiny, you are making a very, very severe allegation, a suggestion that there is no separation of powers, a suggestion that a law enforcement agency is being used in a political way. Do you have any evidence of that?
Well, if I look at things like the AFP does operate independently, but I've got no doubt in my mind that the Commissioner would have been mindful of the ruckus that was caused in the last election when Stephen Conroy's office was raided, and they can control the timing of their activities, and I'm sure they are sensitive to some of these sorts of things. So let's not pretend that that these sorts of considerations don't come into play when the police are planning what it is they're going to do. The police and Home Affairs operate in a political context.
So, just to be clear here, are you saying that the Federal Police are independent and have not been used as a political tool? Are you, in other words, retracting your accusations, or are you standing by them?
No, I'm saying that what happened last week was unnecessary, and indeed the timing of it. And we will we will ask the AFP when they next appear before the Senate what all of the things that went on in the background were in order to fully understand and appreciate what has happened here.
Yeah, but hang on a second. We can ask questions, we can raise doubts, we can talk about the need for legal changes, but you have said very clearly that the AFP has been used here in a political fashion. Now, that's an outrageous claim. It strikes to the very heart of our democracy and the separation of powers. You either have some evidence for that or you don't. Do you have any evidence of the AFP being used in a political fashion?
I have no doubt in my mind that the AFP would have had a number of considerations as they planned these particular operations, and they would have been very mindful of what happened back in the 2016 election when they raided Stephen Conroy's parliamentary office and the house of one of his staffers. They would have been mindful of the circumstances and what fell out from that.
Of course they're going to be mindful of their operations. They're always going to be mindful of whatever it is they're doing. But you've suggested here that they were doing the bidding of the minister and the department in order to put pressure on the media, on journalists. Do you stand by that claim or not? Because there's certainly no evidence come forward of any of that.
I'm suggesting that decisions made around those raids would have been done so in a politically calibrated manner, and political calibration can take place internally within the AFP, in terms of senior management considering all aspects of those particular raids. They would not. So you're now telling us.
So you're now telling us that there's no accusation against Peter Dutton or against Mike Pizzullo, the department head. You're now saying that the AFP might have conducted these raids in a bid to do what they thought might please their political masters?
No, you're joining the two issues up. I'm suggesting to you that the Minister and Home Affairs have not. They don't have a good track record of protecting journalistic freedom in the propositions that they've put before the Parliament. I can go back to.
But Senator, you're making an incredibly serious charge here against Peter Dutton, Mike Pizzullo, and the Australian Federal Police, and yet you've been unable to give me any evidence whatsoever to support that claim.
I'm sorry, Chris. These are really, really important issues in the context of democracies. Okay, and so we need to be very mindful of the fact that that if you conduct these sorts of raids, there's talk about different leaks that are and are not being investigated. So there's already some political connotations floating around in respect of that. We need to make sure that we strike the right balance here. I'm all for national security. I'm a former member of the Royal Australian Navy. But national security exists for the purposes of protecting our democracy. But if you take away press freedom, you won't have that democracy anyway.
But aren't you undermining
important issues?
Aren't you undermining our system of democracy right here and now by casting these unfounded allegations about political interference in policing?
This is very much a part of our democracy. We talk about these sorts of things. We bring them out into the open. We have these sorts of discussions.
Yes, but we have evidence. If you're going to make an allegation, you've got to have some evidence.
Well, I've presented to you a proposition that, and maybe you can explain exactly why it is that the government put forward legislation at the start of last year before the Parliament that would have seen pretty much any reporting by a journalist criminalised. Only when they were dragged kicking and streaming through the PJCIS and back into the Parliament did they change that.
All right, you're trying to change the topic here. The point here is there's been a leak of classified material. The police have investigated it, and you are claiming some sort of political imprimatur behind that. And I keep giving you the opportunity, but you provide absolutely no evidence to support your claim.
Respectfully, I don't think you're listening to what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting to you is that, and I invite you to try and explain this, or get someone else on the show to explain this. How did we ever get to the situation where we ended up with our foreign interference and espionage legislation being put into the Parliament that stripped journalists of any protection in respect of reporting? That sort of legislation needs to be properly considered well before it ever gets to the Parliament. And the fact that it didn't tells you there are some cultural and philosophical problems that exist within some of these government departments. And that's the thing that I'm concerned about, and that's why I direct criticism at Peter Dutton and indeed the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs.
Senator, can I give you one last chance? Can I give you one last chance? You've gone public. You continue to make political.
I've given you the answer, Chris, and you're simply not wishing to listen to it.
No, there is a police investigation here, and you've come up with no evidence or no argument even to support why you would make a claim that there's any political imprimatur behind last week's police raids.
Well, I've said to you, I think that Commissioner Colvin and his officers would have considered the timing of this operation, and we will get to that. We'll find out when we get back into the Senate and an inquiry runs of some form, if not a dedicated inquiry, Senate estimates. We will have that conversation, and at that point we'll see exactly what happened.
Well, you've already put the claim out there. That's my point. You've put out the serious allegation out there, and now you're saying you'll find out what went on.
As a senator who represents the state of South Australia, if I see something that is disturbing, and I am very disturbed by the attack on freedom of press that occurred last week, I'm going to say something, and I'm not going to be intimidated by anyone. That is my job, and we will see what arguments and what facts are put on the table as we move forward into the future.
Normally when people make serious allegations, it's beholden upon them to come up with some evidence as well. Just on the tax issue, which is going to be front and centre when Parliament resumes, you talk about integrity in democracy. The government's put up a detailed tax plan. The opposition put up a detailed tax plan. The people had their say. Does this mean that you will support the propositions the government took to the election?
We're working very constructively with the government now to make sure that that these tax cuts are affordable, and that's the current process that we're working through. There's a $158 billion decision, so we need to work through it very carefully. Well,
the voters have had their say. You don't think that that's sufficiently decisive?
Well, let me put a proposition to you. If the vote had fallen the other way and the Labor Party had got in, would you expect Centre Alliance to have backed down from its position of not supporting franking credits, or to suggest to the Labor Party that we didn't agree with their capital gains tax? And
I would say that the Labor Party would have had a very strong argument to say they had a mandate for those changes.
And they would have. And what happens in the lead up to all elections is parties talk about mandates, and then in the trailing wake of an election, people talk about mandates. But I have checked the Constitution. There is no such word as mandate in the Constitution. I represent the people that voted for Centre Alliance. We've been very clear on what our platforms are, and we always, with every piece of legislation, do due diligence. We don't wave anything through. That is the constitutional role of the Senate, is to conduct review of any legislation that's put before us.
So we'll watch this space. Thanks very much for joining us, Senator Rex Patrick.
You're most welcome.